Thank you very much. It's a terrifying pleasure to talk for you today. But it's also a relief, because when I turned up today and this talk is going ahead, a little bit of a relief, because these days when I enter a building and there are encouraging smiles and platitudes, hello Mr. Rogers, I just presume it's going to be another intervention. And they ain't any fun at all, I can tell you. This is a talk about obsession and compulsion. Of all the utterances delivered to me by strangers, my least favourite, after "we can no longer legally serve you," would have to be, "Well, that isn't very rock and roll." It's happened when rummaging for the perfect carrot at a fruit and veg store, waiting in line at the supermarket with a 3-pack of plain black socks, and peering lovingly at ornately sculptured chess sets in a game store in Greenwich Village. It's a regular observation that certain folks feel very comfortable throwing around, but one I feel I have no right of reply to, because to respond would indicate that I had, at the very least, the same preconceptions about what acting rock and roll actually is. Is there a dress code? Is there a club where such folks meet? And did one apply to be a member, or were you asked? Conversely, I've been complimented with being very rock and roll when falling off a bar stool or having a beer for breakfast, which is ironic because these are two early signs that the evening's rock and roll performance will likely not go very well, if at all. Now that definitions of the musical genre known as rock and bloody roll have generally been whittled down to talk of clothing, of hair or bad behaviour, or employed by comedians and game show hosts as a term of parody, I'll weigh in as a fan and offer up my own thoughts. The term was, I believe, originally a euphemism for making love, which suits me fine. I'm a big fan of both the act and what it purports to be a metaphor for, and want to be surrounded by both of them, or stuck right in the middle participating in both for the rest of my days. And if we let this concoction reduce in the pan further, I reckon what we come down to is freedom. To be released from the strictures of work and of convention, and to act purely on the demands of our blood, our imaginations and desires. And if rock and roll is indeed about freedom, then I've committed far greater crimes against its honour than being caught buying indoor plants or reading books on Percy Granger. Because so much of my time making this music, this rock and roll music, which has given me a life, has been navigated by fear. And living in fear doesn't resemble freedom whatsoever, no matter how many times you fall off your bar stool. Until I was 13, all I wanted to be was a footballer and a cricketer. From the time I was 14, all I wanted to be was in a band. Not because I wanted to write songs or purge my soul of its demons or even to find an outlet for my burning creativity. I just wanted to be in a gang, and I equated my desire to be in a rock band with a similar desire to be in the Hole in the Wall gang with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Handsome rogues who got to do naughty, naughty stuff and get away with it. You can drink around campfires and be ogled by admirers, eat beans out of a tin and wake up in a new town every day. Now, I've often told a tale about hearing the Rolling Stones play on a radio when I was getting my teeth drilled in a mobile dentist bus in Adelaide around this time, and that being the moment that the lightning split me down to my roots and leaving me dazed and a little bit confused, but raw and very desperate to know how to make this music that thrilled and confounded me even more than sex. I went from being a kid who, in the words of my grandmother, would be given a tennis ball and then not seen for another week because I was consumed by throwing and running and kicking and hitting, to a rather glum sort who spent any hour not working holed up in his bedroom playing along on a cheap classical guitar to records that I'd saved to buy from my many jobs, all of which involved pizza. Whether it was the making of, the delivering of, or the cleaning up afterwards of. Everything suddenly had a soundtrack, which is really helpful for someone going through the throes of teenagerdom. Don't look up that word, it's not going to be there. For every wildly vacillating mood, there was always a record to accompany it. Bubbling asunder, whilst obsessing over cataloguing riffs by the Ramones and the Replacements and Rory Gallagher and the Runaways, was an anxiety that initially took the form of unease, worry and sleeplessness that accompany any regular adolescence, to one which exploded into a full-blown terror by the time I was 17. lacking the insight to be able to explain what I was experiencing a few times a day, which was the sensation of being punched up from under the chin and landing somewhere else. That somewhere else I can't explain to you even now, but everything became very fragile. My skin felt as weak as rice paper. A gust of wind could rearrange my organs. Everything wonderful, sexual and visceral from the music that I thought was the key to heaven was suddenly something to be feared. I presumed, of course, that it was a hangover from drug experimentation and having a sensitive constitution, and that it would pass. Like a kidney stone. By 17, any dream I had of becoming a football player had long been put to rest, as my daydreams dictated that the life of a globe-trotting, drug-hoovering guitarist would suit me, at least physically. My frame hadn't developed beyond thin, and acne had ravaged my beautiful face to the extent that hiding it behind a few dozen blustering windmill guitar moves felt right. But the freedoms that such a life offered in my daydreams were reined in by nightmares as my anxiety exploded between finishing high school and hastily packing a box of records and ill-fitting paisley shirts and setting off for university. Now, from my comfortable position here in my pre-autumnal days, standing here now, I can see that leaving home and heading off to do a degree I was barely qualified to do whilst I was ailing was not the smartest of ideas. But the foreign surroundings of university did afford me the opportunity to personify my anxiety. If the attacks were the enemy, its foot soldiers were the crafty, louche older students and faculty members whose sole purpose I had ascertained was to poison me. In particular, to intercede in the food chain and render anything served to me as tainted. Now, where that little delusion took up pride of place in my scone is any number of psychoanalysts' guess. I was studying Hamlet, but why anybody would want to poison a barely functioning, broke 17-year-old is anyone's guess. When I was in my first year at university at a party, my drink was spiked with acid, an incident that ramped up and justified my paranoia. But its true beginnings came from somewhere else I haven't yet really located. A strong memory is strolling through the high school ovals in northwestern Sydney singing the song Daydream by the Love and Spoonful. What a day for a daydream. And without warning, being consumed by a dread as strong as it was unexpected. I couldn't blame drugs or trauma this time. It was an odd time, as my parents were divorcing and the house was left to us three kids to have week-long John Hughes film marathons and amateur drinking adventures. But the attack seemed to have no genesis and absolutely killed my affection for the Love and Spoonful to this day. I needed to find a villain to pin the blame on, and I soon conjured up an army of them. There was the baker, that waiter, that bar person, that sandwich maker, and especially the gentlefolk who were mixing unnamed harmful liquids into my margarine. I was so convinced of being a target that at university I would boil water for drinking 2 or 3 times before cooling it back down in large pots in a closely monitored fridge. Coffee was prepared in my little room on campus in the charmingly named Toad Hall, $45 a week, 10 rooms to each floor, communal kitchens. But one brand of coffee and size of vacuum-sealed bag was allowed. I would never eat anything that wasn't prepared by myself, and then only if it was plain white rice, and on special occasions, plain white rice with a dollop of butter. Chocolate was also allowed, but only if dairy milk and only the 400-gram block. And of course, all degustation was most definitely performed in my little hexagonal room. Alcohol was allowed, though it was also very closely monitored. For some ungodly reason, the last dregs of a bottle or a can of beer, that sweet little inch of mystery, was deemed to be possible poison, and the litany of crafty, crappy excuses I'd used to explain my throwing away of the dregs amongst beery and cheery company were a collection of lines best suited for an 8-year-old refusing broccoli. But drink was available, it was sometimes cheap, and it threw a warm, reliable blanket over the demons waiting to claw at me again. Of course, obsessions can be perpetual, and like a snowball rolling, my little obsession gathered momentum. While food and drink were the main suspects, soon all number of surfaces came under suspicion. Ink on my fingers from a newspaper was cause for alarm, but smudges from a music fanzine or magazine necessitated a shutdown of all activities. That's because music had become suspicious and nefarious, if not outright evil. I can remember thumbing through a copy of the English weekly New Musical Express before going to see a movie called Dogs in Space on George Street in Sydney, and those glorious opening scenes began as a young Hugo Race jumped onto the car of some passing thugs after giving hell to a cowering Michael Hutchence. I fell into a well of panic as I became convinced that the print was seeping into my bloodstream and I would soon be in the throes of another unplanned lysergic adventure. As if to script, my habits began to include counting, particularly involving the number 8 in any opening and closing of doors, which messed with my hopes to be chivalrous to all and sundry. Any attempt to politely open the door for man or woman to leave or enter a room, for example, was scuppered by counting methodically under my breath beforehand, and compounded, of course, by the belief that surfaces covered in silver are breeding grounds for evil mites and must be approached by stealthily covered hand. Long sleeves which can be manipulated into mittens at an instant were de rigueur. I have half a wardrobe full of shirts and pullovers with a distended right arm. It is one thing to be ruled by fear and to set up an arsenal of defences that become daily rituals. It's quite another for those to be noticed. I had become quite the expert at hiding my actions in company from about the age of 9, when I acquired a skin condition that caused me to break out in large red blisters all over my face, body and hands, and eventually into my eyelids. This followed a profusion of warts erupting on my hands the year before, which forced me to use a contorted writing style in order not to hide my hands, which was the only time I remember them not being thrust inside my little stubby shorts. This writing style I now imagine looked like a warlock writing spells in his cave, or Raskolnikov in his apartment hallucinating with fever and guilt, but as a 9-year-old it just made me look fucking odd. I airily explained to anyone in the class that this was just the way I was taught to write when I lived in Kalgoorlie as a young boy. This is how we do it, all right? Whatever my excuses for the blisters all over my face, I can't recall, possibly scurvy from my time sailing around the globe with a merry band of pirates. Back at home on a break from university, even when my father caught me furiously scrubbing the outside of an egg that I was planning to crack open and cook in an attempt to show him that I actually ate something other than plain rice, my embarrassment did not supplant my needs. By 19, I'd made some friends through theatre groups who I deemed unwilling to dose or poison me because they were far too smart and funny and good-looking to regard me as anything other than a not unpleasant oddity. Though I suspected when they invited me to Melbourne on a weekend trip for the hell of it, it was because I was borrowing my mum's car that year for work and I was the willing taxi driver. Leading up to the trip, I knew I'd have to eat at some stage, and gleaning my passengers' bohemian ways, well, to me at that stage, I imagined there would be cafes and cheap, darkly lit eating houses with Eastern European fare and plates. Oh, Melbourne, huh? But plainly that would just not do for me. The only solution was to bake a rudimentary damper of thoroughly sifted and examined flour, water and butter the night before leaving, which I could stuff in Tupperware and hide in the boot of my mum's car. I really badly wanted to be friends with this group. Not only were they attractive and intelligent, I suspected that they went to movies in a group and probably had dinner parties, of which one day I could imagine myself attending and quaffing brandy while discussing French film and excusing away my untouched plate of moussaka on religious grounds or something equally as preposterous. As it turned out, the trip was not a great success, as my position in the group was never promoted above that of the driver, and their deeper connections as old friends and lovers left me understandably ostracised. It was just a weekend, but knowing I'd have to fuel myself until my driving duties were done and I could find somewhere to drink myself into peace, I'd wake in the group house in Paran and walk the few kilometres to the Yarra with my little Tupperware container of, essentially, baked glue and get some sustenance while tolerating the surrounds, the river, the birds, the awareness of no one looking at me curiously, just a young man, his Tupperware, and his glue cake, daydreaming of a time when I could maybe be free of unnecessary fears and live in the world again. All of this somehow leads up to the piquant and hopefully funny part of this story as my daydreams of playing in a rock and roll band became a reality. And really, what isn't funny about a spotty middle-class kid attempting to play this glorious rabble of an art form? My older brother Jamie and my best friend Nick were regularly seeing shows in Sydney whilst I was in Canberra and making plans on those long post-show drives to get a band together. When I finally conceded that it was impossible for me to continue studying law and working my few cleaning jobs. Cleaning jobs, of course. Whilst fearful of being in contact with pretty much anything by this stage, I moved back home with my tail between my legs. To extend the zoomorphic metaphors, I had recently started a course of the anti-acne medication Roaccutane that left my skin as coarse as a crocodile's. Rock and roll looked like a great place to hide, Mr. Graney, if only it weren't so grubby and evil. There are practical examples of this evil. I have spent many years in sporting club change rooms following my dad around as a kid when he was an umpire in the Goldfields League of Western Australia, and then as an underwhelming player myself. Even so, there is no smell quite as noxious and pervasive as a microphone that is the property of an inner city Sydney pub. I'd never planned to be a singer, never wanted to, and perhaps never should have. But as I was the only one in the band who could get somewhere near a melody at that stage, and never knew you could buy your own microphone if you could afford it, I was compelled to wrestle with microphones that smelt, if not of hell, then its waste disposal unit. Of course, the stench is only the companion to any number of life-challenging bacterium, the same breeds that cling to instrument cables and live in the carpets of venues and prosper on the chairs strewn around backstage rooms and are the stealthy little warlords of the humid, fetid breathing air trapped inside any venue. The prospects for one with afflictions such as mine in this environment were not rosy. But just as sure as everything and everyone in whatever venue we were lucky enough to get a gig in was a threat and a potential enemy, I was in love with making this music somehow. We didn't yet sound anything like we wanted to. That wouldn't happen until much, much later. But we listened to records and see shows of the bands we loved and daydream and fantasise of being able to make a glorious racket like they could. And so we pushed on with a can of Glen 20 in my pocket and large quantities of medication in my trousers. Cleanliness, I must add, wasn't the obsession. It was a little more complicated than that. It was imagining what flying organisms in the fetid air of vintage clothing stores and specks of discoloration in a corn chip or the bitter taste at the base of a schooner of beer would do to me. I'm quite sure there are as many explanations of what anxiety attacks are as people who experience them. The ones I hear often involve heart palpitations and sweats in non-extraordinary situations that persist as the sufferer begins to believe this can only end in heart attacks and death. Though death was an experience to avoid for as long as possible, my little attacks took a form whereby my thoughts would collapse and expand like bellows. I would become, for example, acutely aware of an inanimate object, which could be that little crease of sculpture in my field of vision and the origins of its creation. The history of it would become something so overwhelmingly dense that I became obsessed with its creationary process. And I would then become aware of my own creation and history, which in turn became dense and then overwhelming and finally a very fucking scary thing indeed. Not actually very fucking scary at all, but my mind interpreted the experience this way, and hours of panic and a heightened awareness of some looming catastrophe had to be tolerated somehow. I do apologise for the bad language. As our little group inexplicably got offered more shows and tours, the half hour or 45 minutes on stage became a refuge, of course. It became the time of day where all the little whispers went away and I could collapse backward and into flash and fury. As we got to tour and clamber into a Tarago van to drive 800 kilometres to the next show, however, there were hours to wrestle with and overcome. I still stashed my beloved glue cake in the van and trusted Bundaberg ginger beer. But once the cake had run out, the days became long until some free beer, unopened and rigorously inspected, became available. When we'd stay at other people's houses, which is what we do if the venue had no accommodation, I'd leave early in the morning and walk around whatever town we were in until soundcheck, rather than make the hosts feel bad at my consistent refusals of hospitality and pathetic excuses as to why. As much as I was hating myself for being so tethered to my little obsessions, I guess from this distance, it kept me away from drugs for a while, and it gave me plenty to write about, and I stayed rather thin. Wow. So here I exist with my little friend. Let's call him Shithead for now. After years of being angry because of what I previously believed he had robbed me of, namely a decade or so when I was at his mercy to the point that I couldn't enjoy the good fortune that had landed in my lap, the spoils, if you will, of being in a semi-successful rock band. Little habits became worse. Number counting was used for getting on aeroplanes, and rituals before leaving or entering a room became as elaborate as they were exhausting. But after a time, maybe about 10 years, they ebbed until they were barely noticeable to anyone but the keenly observant. So it was maybe a decade ago that I immersed myself in the mucky, freewheeling kind of living I felt I'd been deprived of, throwing any caution to the four winds. As someone who found enemies in the passing motes in sunlight, to feel comfortable crushing and snorting up lines of unimaginable constructs felt very liberating indeed. This feeling of liberty, of course, didn't last. An old shithead came back with all the fury of a spurned lover. These days I see the anxiety as a friend. An annoying, tactless one that I would never call, but it's probably saved me from a more narcissistic, self-involved life than the middlingly narcissistic one I'm currently enjoying. If I'd been comfortable in my own skin and not riddled with an odd assortment of obsessions and compulsions, I would have been, I can only imagine, the worst kind of companion. There are remnants of my old habits and obsessions, but these ones, like washing hands often, carrying my own sweet-smelling microphone, and needing to disappear for long hours, can be passed off as little eccentricities. This is one of the lovely benefits of middle age. Another of which is giving very little of a goddamn what others think of you. So last week I left my little office on Swanston Street around 2 p.m, bought myself a baguette, a little half bottle of Beaujolais, and went to sit on the banks of the Yarra. I felt no need to inspect the baguette. I didn't strain the wine, and the floating bits of cork that swam around the rim of my glass bothered me not at all. I just enjoyed the tastes, and I just enjoyed the view, looking around me and nowhere in particular. Just happy to be obsessing about not very much at all, least of all, you phantom poisoners. It wasn't very rock and roll, but it felt very much like freedom indeed. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.